Good evening. Thanks for being back with us for another adult Bible class study. I thought tonight we would go through just some what we may call Bible curiosities, things that maybe you come across that you read in a particular passage and you may say, what exactly does that mean? So these would be more the idea of, the Bible customs, things that stick out, that are part of the landscape or how they did things back then, that probably sounded very different than how we handle certain things today. But I thought, nevertheless, it could be a little bit of interesting study for us to look at some of these things so we understand a little bit more when we are reading. A lot of this information comes from a short book that I have called The Illustrated Guide to Bible Customs and Curiosities, and that's by George Knight. So the first one is money by weight. That's right. We got to realize we look all the way back in Genesis chapter 23. We read this occasion where Abraham paid Ephron the Hittite 400 shekels of silver for a plot of ground, and he was going to use that as a burial site for his family. And that may sound kind of strange. We got to remember, though, for that time, it's not they didn't deal with buying things like we deal today. There was no such thing as coins or paper money. They didn't exist in the New Testament. So Abraham, as we read particularly here, he would pay in basically silver bullions, and these weighed probably about 400 shekels. And that's what obviously you would agree upon the price, but the money, if you think about it, you had to weigh the money rather than counting out bills or coins like we would do today. We're not really sure exactly what the weight of a shekel is, but the word shekel actually in the Hebrew is the word for weight. So that kind of makes sense. So basically their method of indicating a figure or a money amount. A couple other examples you may read in Jeremiah chapter 32 and Zechariah 11 that talks about just basically sharing or making a transaction of something based on weights instead of a money system like we're used to today. How would you like for your parents to pick who you were going to marry? That probably sounds like a strange concept, but actually in Bible times, marriages were arranged by the parents. And basically their children, well, they were expected to abide by the choices that their parents made. And so we see in Exodus chapter 24 how Abraham sent his chief servant back to Mesopotamia, and it was actually a pretty good distance, probably 500 miles, and wanted him to go back and find a wife for his son Isaac. And you may remember reading that story. Basically, he wanted him to have a wife from basically his kinsman, Abraham's. And so the way that would usually work is you read in some different passages you see in Genesis 28:6 as example of this, they would make the proposal would come from the father of the groom. And then after his offer was accepted by the father of the bride, then the groom's father would actually pay a dowry or what they call sometimes a bride price to the bride's parents. They would do this basically to compensate them for them losing, someone that was going to be a part of their family or services in their household that the daughter would do, that now they would maybe have to pay someone like a servant to pick up some of the things that she would do that she wouldn't be able to do now that she was gone. That's what I'm saying. So now there are occasions, as we see, I put there in Judges 14, where a young man would basically ask to be allowed to marry to a certain girl of choice, but the parents still had to give their approval and go through that. That's a lot different than where we think about marriages and arrangements today in America. Speaking of finding a bride and working through that marriage process, in Bible times we talked about, the family would give a dowry, which is the price basically to be paid to the family. Well, there were occasions where, if the groom or his family couldn't afford to pay the dowry, and that could be in money or that could be in livestock, then the bride's father could require the groom to basically work for him to pay off the debt. Probably the most familiar example you see to this is when Laban required Jacob uh, to work for him for 7 years so that he could marry his daughter Rachel. And of course, we know that deception that happened there, but part of that was because at that point in time, Jacob was by himself. He didn't have a family, he didn't have anything to pay for Rachel. And so he decided to say, yes, I will work for that. So have you ever asked yourself what exactly is a pit? If you remember the story of Joseph and his brothers where they took him, they cast him, it says, into a pit. Well, what exactly was that? It tells us that the pit was empty in Genesis 37. It didn't have any water in it. Well, what was the purpose of it? Well, the Hebrew word for pit, it actually also could be translated as cistern. And so basically these were made to hold water. So this was probably a dry cistern or something that had been abandoned. So they would use these as rainfall water would basically run off and was channeled into these pits for basically as a backup plan for the dry months in the summer. And so these pits were different from wells. You can kind of read a little bit different about wells in that Genesis 24, and that's the verses down there at the bottom. Basically, wells, as we know even today, that they're filled constantly with fresh water from underground water table, and so that's a little bit different than this pit that he was thrown into. That seems more man-made in and of itself. So we know that these pits, they can be used as prisons. In the case of Joseph, his brothers probably intended to leave him there to die. And then they changed their minds, as we remember, and then they tried to draw him up, and they sold him into slavery into Egypt. In fact, Jeremiah, is that reference there in Jeremiah 38, it tells us about how Jeremiah was also imprisoned in one of these pits or cells. And his cell was probably, if you read there, more uncomfortable than Joseph's, where it says there was no water, no mud. So I'm sure you've probably heard of embalming before. That's a pretty common term for us to think about, but they actually did have that way back in the Old Testament, although it wasn't used very often. You look in Genesis chapter 50, the first couple of verses there where it says Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father, and the physicians embalmed Israel or Jacob. And for 40 days were fulfilled for him, and so fulfilled the days of those who were embalmed. It's actually only two references we read about this idea of embalming, once with Jacob and then Joseph, found in Genesis chapter 50. The word embalming apparently refers to this unique method of preparing the body for burial used by ancient Egyptians. And so different methods obviously were used depending on the person's, basically their status or their stature. So, the bodies of the kings and people that were, I guess, highly regarded or great distinction they were put through a very sophisticated, process. They removed the internal organs. They would soak the body for several days in a special chemical, and then finally they would wrap the body up very tightly in those strips of linen cloths and put it in a coffin, and that's sort of where we think about mummies today. And even those mummies, even today, have been some discovered, and in these ancient, tombs, these royal tombs of Egypt, and they've been surprised of basically how remarkably, consistent the bodies have been in the preservation state. Talking about probably over 3,000 years. They've been in those tombs. And so that's what we see Jacob and Joseph both in the embalming process. What is manna exactly? You read about that in Exodus chapter 16 of what the Israelites ate. It's basically this bread substitute, right? We read about the Israelites complaining of what they had to eat, early in verse 3 and verse 4, is God then promised to basically rain bread from heaven, is what it says in verse 4. So early in the morning, they would go and they would pick up this mysterious substance that appeared on the ground, and they would gather enough just for just to feed their family for that day. That's what they were told to do there in verse 16 through 19. Well, the people called this substance manna. It's a Hebrew word that means, what is it? We read later in verse 31 basically what they thought it was. Basically, it tasted like the seed of a coriander plant. It's what they reference it as, and that's basically an herb that's used to season food. But of course, they would eat this for a time period. If you remember reading over in verse, I guess it was the next verse in verse 32, where it talks about how Moses and Aaron commanded them to basically take an omer or take some of this manna and preserve it and put it into the ark for the people of their generations to come as sort of a memorial staple. And so that's manna. Speaking of food, what about the forbidden fruit? No, I'm not making a reference to the tree that Adam and Eve were not supposed to eat of, but actually we read about it in Leviticus chapter 19. A lot of different rules and laws that God put in place that sometimes people may have looked at, or we especially look at and say, well, why exactly did he tell them not to eat this and not to eat that? In Leviticus 19:23, it said, when you come into the land, you shall plant all manner of trees for food, and shall count the fruit thereof as uncircumcised, or forbidden, is what more of the modern translations translate it as. It says 3 years it shall be unto you, uncircumcised unto you, it shall not be eaten of. And so it's like, why did God tell them not to eat of the trees for the first 3 years? Well, the instructions probably had what we would think is a very practical application. Not picking the fruit off the new trees in Canaan for the first 3 years would allow the fruit to be eaten instead by the animals, and then the animals would therefore basically take the seeds and spread the seeds on their own. The people didn't have to do that, and that would basically lead to more new trees and contribute to the prosperity and the fruitfulness of the land in general, where the Israelites didn't have to plant every single thing. At least that's what most scholars believe of why he did this. And finally tonight, let's talk a little bit about olives. You read a lot about this type of how they used olive and olive trees. It was a very important crop, in Palestine, since it provided not only food that they used as far as the table, but also fuel. They would use it to burn the oil for burning the lamps, in their homes. We read about olives and the olive tree, especially kind of in a metaphorical way. In the Bible, the psalmist in Psalm 52:8 describes himself as a green olive tree because he was so richly blessed by the Lord. And also Hosea, and he's going to say, as in the future Messianic age, the blessing of Israel will be as an olive tree. Specifically, what we find in Deuteronomy 24, he talks about leaving the olives for the poor, and gives some description there. And basically, what he meant was this was a part of the law as well, and it shows that God had, he had concern, as we see throughout the scriptures, for the poor and taking care of them. So what they would do is the olives would be harvested, where they would beat the branches of the trees with sticks, and then the ripe olives would be gathered when they fell to the ground. But the law told them that the trees are not to be beaten a second time. Basically the idea was to leave the olives that would ripen later on, since the first beating, for those to be left for the gleaning by the poor and by the disadvantaged. And this is part of, you see this in some references, is like Ruth, they go out to gain things, to glean from the field as the poor would. I hope this Bible study, although a little bit different, a little bit interesting, um, take we took on studying some things, but these may be some curiosities that you have. You just, as we're reading the story of the Bible, there's some things, just like I said, a part of their, seem like their everyday part of life that seem out of context or very different from us today. And that's why I thought we would just take a little bit look at some of these random things, and hope you learned something, and maybe we'll do this again. Thank you for tuning in, and we will be back again Sunday for another lesson.